The battle was won. 6,000 exhausted men had just crushed an impossible French army of 30,000. But in the blood-soaked mud of Agincourt, King Henry V gave an order that wasn't a victory, but a moral crime. He commanded his soldiers to murder every single prisoner they had taken. Was this ruthless strategy, sheer panic, or the darkest choice in English history? To understand that moment, you first have to understand the nightmare they walked into. The long, grueling, exhausted column of men stumbled through a landscape determined to swallow them whole. It wasn't the roar of battle that defined the campaign of 1415, but the sickening, sucking sound of thousands of boots dragging through the deep, wet mud of northern France. This was not the glamorous conquest of legends, but a desperate retreat, a gamble gone ruinously wrong that would lead directly to that unforgivable moral choice. For King Henry V of England, the conquest of France was a divine right. He believed he was restoring the lands of his ancestors, a cause rooted in legal claim, but requiring immense violence to enforce. Yet, 4 months into his great adventure, the reality was disaster. The victorious siege of Harfleur had been purchased at a terrible price, not just the loss of supply and time, but the relentless enemy of medieval warfare, disease. Dysentery had ripped through the army, transforming fit men into frail, feverish ghosts. The king, who had left England with an army of over 10,000 men, now led a force barely more than half that size. They were shadows, plagued by hunger, and hunted by the overwhelming might of the French monarchy. The psychological situation was as critical as the physical. The English soldiers were not only physically weakened, but their morale was brittle, held together only by discipline and faith in their king. They were attempting a dangerous flanking march north to the relative safety of the English-held port of Calais, traversing hostile territory where every village was a potential ambush. Every abandoned cart, every sickened soldier left behind, was a painful reminder that the end of this campaign was likely to be death or captivity. King Henry V knew his men were desperate, but he relied on their professional discipline and, more critically, the promise of God's favor, which he sought through strict piety and unwavering resolve. This belief in divine favor, however, was about to clash violently with mortal necessity. Henry V was a singular figure, deeply pious, a reformer who carried a sense of righteous purpose, but also a leader of cold, unyielding pragmatism. He believed his cause was just, yet he marched with the meticulous efficiency of a man who understood that God helps those who help themselves. His small, professional army, hardened by the siege and desperate for salvation, moved slowly, their pace dictated by the dwindling stores and the ever-present threat of a French interception. The French, meanwhile, watched. They didn't need to fight a battle. They simply had to wait for disease and hunger to consume the invaders. But national pride would not allow it. The French nobility viewed their enemy with contempt, believing they had already defeated the English by simply allowing nature and disease to take their course. They were about to learn the terrible cost of that arrogance, marching toward the decisive, deadly mud of Agincourt. But the French were not content to wait for fate. They had prepared a trap so massive, Henry knew only a miracle or a monstrous gamble could save him. The French nobility, bursting with confidence, saw not a trap, but an insult. They had chased the English to the north, effectively cutting off their retreat to Calais. Here, on the flat, freshly ploughed fields near the village of Agincourt, the French would finally descend to crush the exhausted, diseased English remnants. The sheer scale of the force assembled was staggering. The odds were undeniable. The English faced a French force of at least 25,000, and perhaps as many as 30,000 men, dwarfing Henry's 6,000. This wasn't a contest, it was an execution. Yet, the English king chose not to flee, but to confront the oncoming storm, planting his tiny, desperate banner on the field of his choosing. He knew that the only path to survival lay in victory, however impossible the odds seemed. They knew the sheer scale of the slaughter to come. What they didn't know was which side would be doing the killing. The night of October 24th, 1415, was miserable. Rain lashed down, turning the fresh furrows of the ploughed fields into a deep, clinging mud pit, a gift for the English, though no one yet recognized it as such. The French camp was a carnival of noble confidence. Knights, weighed down by immense, beautiful plate armor, joked and gambled, convinced the dawn would bring an easy victory and the humiliation of the English king. Their commanders, ignoring the hard-won lessons of previous defeats, planned a charge by massive, heavily armored columns, confident the weight of steel would simply roll over the English line. They were so certain of victory, they had already discussed how they would divide the enormous ransoms of the English nobles, tallying the fortunes they expected to seize and even arguing over who would get the right to imprison Henry V himself. Meanwhile, in the small English camp, a very different mood settled. The men confessed their sins, prepared their weapons, and prayed. There was no joking, only grim resolve. King Henry V ordered absolute silence, a psychological tactic designed to contrast their focused discipline against the French revelry, lending an aura of piety and control to his desperate force. His men knew they were hopelessly outnumbered, but the king reminded them that they were fighting not just for their lives, but for their immortal souls, contrasting the heavy burden of the French with the spiritual lightness of their own humble ranks. Henry V walked among them, his presence a steady anchor in the sea of fear, his commitment to the battle absolute. This profound difference in attitude, the spiritual preparation versus the overweening arrogance, was the true initial battle fought that night. It was an army prepared to die against an army prepared to feast. The stage was set not just for a battle, but for a massacre, though history had yet to decide which side would be the victim. Henry V knew he could not maneuver. He knew his men were spent. He chose the battlefield for one reason. It was small. Flanked on both sides by dense woods, the field of Agincourt acted like a massive funnel, forcing the vast French army to compress its front into a narrow band of ground. This single tactical choice negated the French advantage of overwhelming numbers, forcing the French to advance in dense, constricted formations where their great strength became their greatest weakness. But Henry's true weapon was the English longbow. His archers were positioned along the flanks, but crucially, they were also armed with sharpened wooden stakes known as palings. These stakes were hammered into the muddy ground, creating a lethal, pointed fence to impale any oncoming French cavalry charge. It was an invention born of necessity, simple, brilliant, and devastating. The stakes were the final, silent promise of slaughter. The morning of October 25th, 1415, broke cold and bleak. Both sides stood motionless for hours, staring across the churned, muddy ground. It was Henry V who made the critical, provocative move, ordering his men to advance. They dragged themselves forward, inch by painful inch, to the limit of their archers' effective range, setting the range for the French. Faced with this defiant advance, the French nobility, impatient and boiling with pride, could wait no longer, viewing the English movement as both an invitation and a final insult. The first French line, composed of thousands of heavily armored men-at-arms and cavalry, began its fateful charge. It was doomed before it even reached the English lines. The deep mud acted as a crippling drag, exhausting the war horses and the men within seconds. An armor-clad knight weighed approximately 200 pounds without the mud. Struggling against the churned earth, they were quickly exhausted, many collapsing under the weight of their own ambition, sinking up to their knees in the wet clay. As the French slogged forward, the air filled with the terrifying, hissing sound of tens of thousands of English arrows. They did not fall like rain. They came like a continuous, dark cloud, finding the gaps in the expensive French armor, the armpits, the eye slits, the unarmored joints. The front ranks of the French collapsed, creating a devastating obstacle for those following. The arrow storm was not just a physical killer, it was a psychological hammer blow. The French, expecting a clean charge and a glorious melee, found themselves bogged down, skewered, and suffocated. As the French pressed, the funnel effect of the terrain became catastrophic. The dead and wounded piled up, forcing the forward momentum to stall. The sheer density of the French formation meant they were unable to use their weapons effectively. They were simply crushed forward onto the English line, where Henry's small force of men-at-arms, fighting with relative freedom of movement, faced an enemy already half defeated by terrain and exhaustion. The English, nimble and lightly armored, used short swords, axes, and mallets to batter and dismantle the exhausted French knights. The ensuing melee was brutal and deeply personal. The English men-at-arms, fighting for their lives, used hammers and mallets to smash and shatter the French armor, forcing the rich, exhausted nobles to surrender. Victory was no longer just about survival, it was suddenly about wealth. To an English foot soldier, the capture of a single French nobleman meant a potential windfall that could change his entire life. This economic reality dictated the early phase of the English success, motivating them to take prisoners rather than simply kill the high-ranking knights. If you're finding this deep dive into medieval strategy compelling, please hit that subscribe button. It helps us keep bringing you the untold moments of history. As the French first line buckled and broke, the battlefield transformed into a chaotic and contradictory scene. English soldiers, battered and bruised, but utterly galvanized by their success, began the traditional, lucrative work of taking prisoners. To an English common soldier, a captured French knight meant a potential fortune, a year's pay or more, secured by the noble's promise to pay a ransom. This was the brutal economy of medieval warfare, and in the space of half an hour, hundreds of high-value French nobles were being dragged, disarmed, and pushed behind the thin English lines. The victory was immense, but it created an instant, overwhelming military liability. The English were winning, but their greed had just given the French army 1,000 lethal weapons. And King Henry V knew it. The English now had a deadly dilemma. They were holding hundreds of extremely valuable, but entirely unsecured, prisoners, an army of men who could, at any moment, seize a weapon from the pile of debris, or be easily rearmed if the French second line managed to break through. Henry's tiny force was split, with many valuable fighters now tied up guarding their captives. Every soldier guarding a prisoner was one less man holding the line, a terrifying erosion of their meager defenses. The second wave of French attack was far weaker, demoralized by the slaughter of their peers, and hesitant to advance over the mountain of bodies created by the first line. This attack too was repulsed, primarily by the relentless, focused power of the longbowmen. But even as the English consolidated their position, the battle was not over. A large contingent of the French army, estimated by chroniclers to be around 600 knights and men-at-arms, was still hovering in the distance, seemingly intact and potentially preparing for a decisive final push. This force was a constant, terrifying shadow on the horizon, an unexploded bomb waiting for the right moment to strike. Critically, a separate force, led by a local nobleman, launched an opportunistic attack on the largely unprotected English baggage train located in the rear, away from the main fighting. The baggage train contained not just supplies, but the English non-combatants, servants, and the king's personal reserve of weapons and banners. Worse, it was the holding area for the growing number of French prisoners. When the cry reached the king, a cry that screamed of the French rear attack and the possible liberation of the prisoners, Henry V was faced with a choice that would define his legacy forever. He could not spare a single man to reinforce the rear. He could not allow his flank to be compromised. And he absolutely could not tolerate the thought of the hundreds of French nobles behind him seizing weapons, turning the battle into a trap, and slaughtering the English from the rear. This was not a hypothetical risk. The prisoners needed only a moment of chaos, a flash of opportunity, to launch a successful, lethal rebellion that would guarantee Henry's death and the utter destruction of his army. The fate of the entire English campaign hinged on the next 30 seconds. In that heart-stopping moment, with the remaining French forces still a threat and chaos engulfing his rear, King Henry V gave the most cold-blooded, brutal order of the entire campaign. He commanded that every single French prisoner was to be killed. The order was met with stunned silence and then immediate, violent refusal. These prisoners were not just enemies, they were capital. To kill them was to destroy the fortune of the men who had captured them. English knights and men-at-arms outright disobeyed the command. They simply could not bring themselves to execute their own ransoms, a violation of the very economic code that governed their lives and the chivalric code that granted safe passage to surrendered nobles. Henry V was unwavering. He was facing total annihilation, trapped between a massive, unengaged French reserve and a potential armed revolt behind his own lines. He knew the traditional codes of chivalry, but military necessity superseded honor. He assigned a trusted, ruthless officer with a detachment of 200 archers to carry out the deed. This time, the order was enforced. The archers, men who were less bound by the chivalric codes of the nobility and had no personal investment in the ransoms, fell upon the disarmed French prisoners with knives, axes, and daggers. It was a methodical, terrifying slaughter of men who had already surrendered, a violation against the very concept of ransom and surrender. The cries of the dying men echoed across the battlefield, a brutal, horrifying testament to the collapse of honor in the face of survival. The entire event lasted perhaps 15 minutes. It was a military stroke of pure, ice-cold logic, neutralized the threat of internal rebellion by eliminating the source. It was an act born not of malice, but of the most extreme, life-or-death pragmatism. Yet it shattered the medieval conventions of warfare. It was a moment where the King of England shed the high rhetoric of chivalry for the ugly necessity of survival, forever leaving the question, was this a necessary strategy for a surrounded commander, a crime fueled by panic, or simply a reminder that war has no moral bottom line? If you want to delve deeper into the morality of these historical moments, leave a comment below with a decision you think deserves scrutiny. The wave of panic that had driven the prisoner slaughter soon dissipated. The French attack on the baggage train was driven off, and the sight of their captured countrymen being ruthlessly executed may have broken the already shattered morale of the remaining French forces. With the rear now secured, Henry V reformed his men for what he believed would be the final, fatal French push. But that push never came. The remaining French commanders, witnessing the utter collapse of their two previous assaults, and perhaps hearing the horrifying cries from the execution field, refused to commit their men. They held their position for a short while. Then, with a slow, agonizing hesitation, they began to melt away, their confidence entirely spent. The battle was over. The English had won an impossible victory. The silence that fell over the field was horrific, broken only by the sounds of the dying. The mud was a sickening stew of blood, armor, and human remains. The death toll was staggering and entirely one-sided. While the English had lost only a few hundred men, perhaps fewer than 600, the French dead numbered in the thousands, 7,000 to 10,000 according to most contemporary sources. Among the slain were 3 dukes, 5 counts, and nearly 90 barons, the very flower of French nobility, killed by archers and common soldiers. The sheer disparity in losses was unprecedented in medieval European history, a testament to the combined effects of the mud, the arrows, and the decisive nature of Henry V's commands. The immediate aftermath was defined by 2 facts: the crushing victory and the moral devastation of the prisoner execution. Henry V had achieved military immortality, a triumph that would secure his crown and his place in history, but he had paid a price in reputation. Though he argued that the execution was necessary to save his army from the risk of a counterattack, the news of the slaughter of disarmed nobles was met with shock and criticism across Europe. For many, the act, regardless of its military logic, was an unpardonable breach of the sacred laws of chivalry. Agincourt proved that the longbow, discipline, and tactics could defeat sheer numbers and steel. But the prisoner execution proved that even a devout, honorable king would sacrifice every ethical code if it meant the survival of his army. The battle is thus remembered as a legendary feat of arms, but also as a dark, cautionary tale about the true cost of warfare. The order to kill the prisoners remains the most controversial and scrutinized command of Henry V's entire life, a moment where the needs of the battlefield savagely overwhelmed the traditions of honor. Be sure to share this script if you know someone who loves military history, and subscribe to our channel for more untold stories that question the easy narratives of the past. The field was won, the ransom collected from those who survived the execution, and the retreat to Calais was secured, but the shadow of that ruthless 15-minute slaughter on the orders of a king who claimed divine favor would linger for centuries. The victory was secured, but the question remains: when a king orders murder for survival, is it a war crime, the ultimate act of panic, or simply the price of necessity?